So I wasn't actually originally going to write anything but the Bone season until the series was finished, but I actually had quite a lot of trouble with the third book in the series. I think every author I know had a book that just shook their confidence so badly, and for me that was the Song Rising. Like I'm very happy with how it turned out, but the process of getting it there was quite difficult. I switched editors, and my editor was used to editing YA, for example, so the book ended up being much shorter than the others. It's like noticeably, significantly shorter. So anyway, while that was with my editor, I decided that I had to write something else because I'm very lucky that I'm a full-time author and I didn't really have anything to do when the book was with my editor. So I've always loved dragons since I was a kid. And I was raised in the Church of England, and St. George and the Dragon was one of the stories I learned growing up. It's like a very foundational story in England, the heroic English figure who slays the dragon and gets the damsel in distress. And I've always been fascinated with it since I was a kid, and I was so interested in the origins of the story. Because it's thought that the real St. George was a real historical figure. And they also think he wasn't English. So I was interested to know how he became English in the popular imagination. And I ended up doing lots of research on it. And I uncovered just various versions of the story that I felt were both interesting and quite ugly, actually, quite problematic in nature. George is often presented as sort of triumphing over people from other religions and other races, and it really there's one particular version of it from the Elizabethan era that I honestly found just so profoundly disturbing. Like it's very, very misogynistic, it's very racist, and I felt like that version of the story needed to be challenged. So I took several elements from that story, which is called The Famous History of the Seven Champions of Christendom by Richard Johnson. I took a couple of elements that Johnson invented. So, for example, his version of the story is where the orange tree comes from. He imagined St. George fighting the dragon underneath an orange tree. So I decided that I was going to take the orange tree and do something good with it that Johnson probably would have hated, to be honest. And I decided to create this society of dragon slayers and have the story be that the damsel was the one who slayed the dragon and that the George figure stole the credit. And then two separate religions develop based on this story. And I'm fascinated by religions that are very different but have a similar point of origin. So, for example, the three Abrahamic religions all have very similar roots, but are nonetheless quite different faiths. And I wanted to do something similar where you have these two religions that almost oppose each other, but they do grow from the same single historical event. So Priory of the Orange Tree begins nearly 1,000 years after the defeat of the Nameless One, which was this giant red dragon that attempted to destroy the world. In my world, dragons come from a certain volcano. There's every time the volcano erupts, it creates these destructive fire-breathing worms. So this dragon came, it was defeated. 1,000 years later, it looks like he's probably coming back. And it's quite a classic sort of Tolkien-esque fantasy in terms of its structure, in that it's a quest fantasy. We're gathering items to destroy the big bad. But I wanted it to be very focused on women and queer women specifically, people that historically the fantasy genre did not particularly cater to and did not have a lot of room for. And I wanted it to be a story that celebrated diversity rather than demonizing it in the way that I think Richard Johnson does in the original version of the story. And the main character, arguably, is Ede. So she is a lady in waiting to Queen Sabran of Innis. Sabran is a descendant of the man who supposedly slayed the Nameless One. And there is a legend that as long as Sabran's bloodline continues, the Nameless One will be held in chains. But that means she has to have a child, and each queen in her line only has one child, so they can't pass the burden on to a sibling or anything. It has to be them. And for me, it was like a sort of exploration of how women are often told that we have to have children because otherwise humankind will end. And it's sort of like all of that burden is being put on this one family, this one bloodline. And Sabran is very, very afraid of having children. And through Ede, we learn more about her. Ede secretly comes from a religion that is separate to Sabran's, where she knows the truth about who really killed the Nameless One. And she has to sort of she's protecting Sabran, but she also doesn't agree with her on a lot of things. And then they end up falling in love. And I loved writing the relationship. It's a very sort of complicated relationship between Ede and Sabran. The other characters include Nicolaes, who is an alchemist who has been banished from the West, and he's now at this teeny tiny trading post off an island called Seiki. And the relationship between Seiki and Nicolaes' country, Mentenden, is inspired by the relationship between the Japanese and the Dutch. They basically Japan went through a period called Sakoku, which was like nobody was really allowed in or out. But they had this one small trading post for the Dutch on an island called Dejima, like a little man-made island. And I just found that so interesting. It was like all of this exchange between these two cultures was just happening on this teeny, teeny, tiny island that no one was really allowed to leave except under special circumstances. Um, and you had, there was an exchange of knowledge and just ships coming and bringing things in and out, but all just through that very, very small funnel. He's kind of in this place that he doesn't really understand, and he can only see just over the wall of this small island. He can't see much else. But he ends up going on this adventure with pirates. Then the other character is Tane, who is a dragon rider. So in her country, dragons are more benevolent and they're more associated with water. And they are completely opposed to the fire-breathing worms. And Tane has to go on her own journey where she loses her dragon and then has to get her dragon back. But yeah, it's pretty classic in terms of its structure. It's kind of find items to kill the bad guy. But within that fairly simple story structure, I try to do a lot of complicated character work. And there's a magic system based on alchemy. So there's like star magic from the sky and fire magic from under the earth. Well, this magic system is like I said, I kept it quite simple because I knew that I was going to be doing quite a lot of complex character work, and there was going to be a lot of world building to get to grips with in terms of there's multiple cultures, there's multiple religions within each culture. So I felt like I was going to keep the magic system quite simple. So it's based on the alchemical concept of as above, so below. The idea of two sort of equal and opposing forces needing to be kept in balance, and when they are out of balance, terrible things happen, such as volcanoes going off and dragons coming out. And the whole series is about essentially what happens when these two forces are out of balance. And I still haven't revealed what caused them to go out of balance in the first place. That will be one of the deep mysteries of the series that are revealed over time. Um, but yeah, I just wanted to keep it quite simple. So actually, it's not particularly hard to keep track of that magic system. It's just one type of dragon is based on one kind of magic and one is based on the other kind of magic. So every 500 years or so, this comet goes, passes the world and it releases star magic that is supposed to cool the fire magic down and stop it from getting out of control. But the fire magic is currently heating up too quickly. So you have this little period before the comet comes where things are out of control and very dangerous. And that's when dragons and humans come into conflict with each other. But yeah, it's not quite as complex as the magic system of the Bone Season series. Like that one is much bigger and it has, all of these different abilities and different categories of ability and all different colors associated with each one. But actually the Priory magic system is pretty simple. Among the Burning Flowers was an interesting one because I think of it as a sort of prequel to the Priory of the Orange Tree. Like, well, a prelude almost. It is a prequel, but it's so close to Priory that it almost directly flows into it in a way that it's like an extended prologue almost to the Priory of the Orange Tree. And it follows a character called Marosa, who is mentioned in the Priory of the Orange Tree, and we do get to meet her and we find out a little bit about her backstory. But I wanted to expand on her because she is the Don Mata, which is like the heir to the Kingdom of Iskalin. And Iskalin is a country that has been faithful to the saint, who is the St. George figure, for many centuries. And at the beginning of the Priory of the Orange Tree, you find out that they have betrayed the saint and they've started worshipping the Nameless One, the dragon that he defeated. And although we do get to see Iskalin in the Priory of the Orange Tree, we don't really find out how that happened and how it happened so quickly. And I really wanted to explore that from Marosa's perspective because she's essentially stuck in this giant tower and she cannot get out of her city. Her city has been overtaken by this terrifying dragon called Firidel, and she doesn't really have any way to fight him. And I wanted to explore the idea of what can you do when you can do nothing. And I think that this is something I've been feeling more and more in recent years. We see so many horrific things happening in the world, and sometimes there are things that you can do to help, and sometimes you can't think of any way to help. You feel completely powerless to help people. And Morosa is really in that position. She's in this tower, she sees her people suffering, and she can do nothing. And she tries to do things, she does everything she can think of, but ultimately she cannot defeat the dragon from the position that she's in. So I was just really interested in exploring the mindset behind that, like what the psychology of not being able to do anything in that situation. So she's one of the characters, and then one of the characters is her betrothed, Albrecht, who is living across the mountains in Mentenden. And again, he's not really able to help her. Albrecht looks like he should be the Prince Charming who is going to ride and save Morosa in the classic damsel in distress sort of way. But again, he can't reach her. So, who is the prince when he can't rescue the princess? What does the damsel do when the prince isn't coming? And then you have the third character, Malago, who represents the ordinary people in this situation. I am very fascinated by royalty and particularly hereditary monarchy. I talk about that quite a lot in this series, but I also like to have at least one character who is not royal and just represents ordinary people caught up in everything that's going on. And Malago is she basically hunts draconic creatures for money, which is an incredibly dangerous job. In this world, dragons and their offspring, which the draconic army, they can be all sorts of creatures like basilisks and things from like medieval bestiaries. But in my world, they spread this terrifying plague. And this plague causes you to feel like you are burning alive from the inside. It's like an excruciating, drawn out death. And so every time Malago fights one of these creatures, she's risking getting that plague. Um, but she kind of has to because she's a fugitive and she can't do normal work. So she's stuck doing this culling, as it's called. And yeah, that was scary to write. I try to make my dragons and draconic creatures as frightening as possible in these books. And I'm really interested in caves, actually. Like it's such a weird obsession to have, but I'm so fascinated by caving stories and stories of caving gone terribly wrong. And I'm really interested in people who are drawn to very dangerous, extreme hobbies like caving and also mountain climbing. And I think that really comes out in the series. There's a lot of scenes of people climbing extreme mountains and, nearly dying from altitude sickness. And I have wrote these scenes of Malago crawling into these sort of filthy caves to fight draconic creatures and just really claustrophobic. And I had to imagine, what it would be like to fight this horrific monster at very close quarters in a pitch black cave. So that was a very different type of story to Morosa's and Albrecht's, which are more about courtly intrigue and, interfamilial conflict. Marissa is kind of held prisoner by her own father, who is this very deeply paranoid, religiously fanatic man. So that was interesting to explore in, I suppose, a similar way to Paige and Jackson's relationship in the Bone Season. I love a toxic father-daughter relationship.